Okay, so my goal here is to talk about Mary's commitment to the development of women in science. And I really love this picture because it shows Mary at her desk with a lot of stuff, lots of reprints and files and things. And that, how do I go forward? Okay. And that is, you say, oh, there's all that stuff, but it actually was a gift to those of us who have been looking through her files because there's a lot of interesting information there. And in particular, I got all the files. Oops, how do I forward? There. I got all the files that said Mary Bunge papers about women in science. And so I spent weeks pouring through these files, and the connections and things, material goes back to the 60s. And it's really a fascinating story about her career and her interest in women and passion for promoting women in scientific careers. Oops, here I go. Okay, so I want to sort of set the stage. You just heard from James that Mary got her Ph.D. in 1960. And then she went to WashU in 1970. And just think about that time. I thought it was good to put this in its perspective. So that was really the beginning of the women's movement and affirmative action. The Civil Rights Act was passed in 1964 and the Equal Pay Act in 1963. But at that time, it didn't include employers performing educational functions at colleges and universities. So it wasn't until the early 70s that the laws were changed to encompass professionals and academics. And then around in 1972, the Equal Rights Amendment was passed, but in fact, and in 1974, a lot of states had ratified it, but it is still not a ratified constitutional amendment for the country. So that just goes to show. And also at that time, women started organizing groups at their universities and through scientific societies. So Mary joined, and there's a lot of evidence from lots of newsletters and correspondence as evidence. But to be honest, Mary's generation, they kind of came before this women's movement. That didn't exist when they started their careers. She was getting her training in the 60s. And so they really had to power through on their own and find unique mentors to be able to succeed. And we heard of some of those from James. So in Mary's files, there's quite a bit of stuff from the early 70s. And one of the group of newsletters there was from this group called AWARE, which was a group that formed at Washington University, where she was a new professor. And that stood for Academic Women Allied for Rights and Equality. And this group was for women at WashU who were involved in teaching and research. It went from graduate students to professors. And it was to examine the problems and realities faced by professional university women so that they could think about ways they could take appropriate action to remedy the inequities they saw in the system. They also did statistical analysis, and this was what the profile looked like at WashU in the early 70s. So 290 males, 27 females. The professors were 120 of them were male, 5 females. Associate professors, 81 males, 5 females. Got a little better at the assistant professor stage. 89 males and 17 females. And also at that time, because of the change in the laws at the federal level, universities had to form affirmative action committees and develop proposals to send to the Department of HEW at the federal level. And so this group also was helping advise this affirmative action committee about what they should, what kind of things that they should put in their policy. So the other group that Mary seemed to be affiliated with at that time was the Women in Cell Biology which is the ASCB, the American Association of Cell Biologists, women's group. And that was in the early 70s. And in fact, that group still exists today in the society. And so they had a newsletter that looked at the composition of the ASCB leadership, who was on the committees, what was the male versus female ratio, editorial boards, authorship, speakers at meetings, articles of interest to women, court cases about discrimination were all in these newsletters that they're fascinating to read. And one of the things I loved was this cartoon in Doonesbury where there's the teacher with their students, hey people, I've got an idea, let's find out what you all want to be when you grow up. First the boys, a football player, I want to be a pilot, a doctor, a drummer, that's great boys. Now, what do you girls want to be? We want to be mommies. Boys, if you'll excuse us, the girls and I have a little to talk about. And I just thought that was a great cartoon that's in this newsletter from the Women in Cell Biology. So I think Mary and her peers were starting to become part of this women's movement and starting to understand the issues of equity for women in science. But before that time, as I said, they just powered through, right? They just wanted to be treated like like to be able to do their science. That was what was important to them. So one of the other women at WashU at that time was Florence Moog, and she was like Mary, but she started to become very active and vocal. And she wrote an article, Male Bias of the NIH. And this got the attention of Elliot Richardson, who was the secretary of HEW. And he said, okay, so now we have to make sure that 1/3 of all the nominees or appointees at NIH had to be women, assuming qualified women are available to fill the vacancies. So you know what that means. And it's also about that time that Mary started collecting articles about women scientists and the career challenges of women. And there was a letter in there, this interesting letter here was one, she was not that outwardly active at that time, but then she wrote this letter to the American Association of Anatomists that she disapproved of their meetings being held in states that have not ratified the Equal Rights Amendment. And all attempts possible should be made to change the arrangements so that they will meet in states that have ratified it. So that was one of the most outward things I saw her actually do during that period of time. So then I went back and looked at this timeline and superimposed her appointments at WashU. And so remember, in 1970, she came to WashU as a research assistant professor. And that was really her choice because she had 2 young sons, and she, how is she gonna juggle her career between doing her science and having children? How could she superimpose service and teaching on top of that? And then in 1972, she was promoted to research associate professor. So that says her research was going really great. And that's about the time when the Civil Rights Act was extended to educational institutions, the ERA passed, the AWARE group at WashU was established. So you have to kind of envision that all of this was starting to influence Mary's thinking about her position as a woman scientist. And so then around that time, she started teaching histology to medical students. So that tells you maybe I should transition to tenure track. And 2 years later, she was promoted to associate professor with tenure. So that was a pretty fast jump. And then in 1978, she became full professor. So, I don't know whether WashU was saying, we need to change things, Mary, you need to go on tenure track, or she made that choice herself. And I talked to a number of people who might have known her from that time, and nobody could really give me an answer, but we can all speculate. That's all we can do. I don't know if Peggy knows. She can tell us later if she knows anything. So one interesting thing in these files I had was that the UME Veritas was going to do a newsletter article about women scientists. This was in 2006. So Mary was sending emails to the person writing the article about her experience. So it says here, my interest in research was highly motivating and overwhelmed concerns about obstacles. This was in response to the question, what obstacles had she faced? I was very fortunate to have, as my PhD mentors, a wonderful man who was gender blind. There were a number of female grad students in the lab, and it didn't occur to me to worry about the obstacles. But then she goes on, the main discrimination that I faced was being underpaid for many years. When I received tenure, I was not given a raise, but was told by the chairman, Max Cowan, Mary, if anything happens to Richard, then we'll raise your salary. It was not until the newsletter arrived from the American Association of Anatomists that I realized how low my salary was compared to the national levels. And she showed the data to the chairman, and she received an appropriate raise 3 years in a row. And I can really relate to this because when I was at CWRU in the 1990s, the same thing happened to me. They did a salary equity, analysis, and all the women faculty were underpaid, and we all got giant raises one year. So exactly, that's like 20 years later too, right? So Mary supported and joined many other organizations for women in science. AWIS is the Association for Women in Science. It still exists today. It was started by women in FASEB, which is another major scientific organization. And there's actually a chapter at FAU of AWIS, and she had a number of newsletters from that organization. She was part of the Women in Neuroscience, which was started in 1980. It was for women in the Society for Neuroscience, but it really was independent of the SFN for quite some time, but would collaborate through the SFN on workshops and mentoring events and things like that. And then there was also Winter, a little later, which was the Women in Neurotrauma Research. And ultimately, WIN was absorbed into a more global professional development committee called TEAM, Training, Education, and Mentoring. And so that's what the committee of the society is, includes women now. And then I want to spend a little bit of time on the ad hoc committee for the development of women careers in neuroscience, which was established in 1991, which I think has a lot of, she did two major things through this committee. So this ad hoc committee for the development of women careers in neuroscience was formed within the SFN. And it had, on this committee, they had mostly women, but there were also some male committee members. Mary became the chair. That's a little unclear, at least by around 1995, because she was writing the minutes of the meetings then. So as a result of being the chair of that committee, she also was on the membership committee of the SFN because they needed the liaison from this ad hoc women's committee. And Mary thought that women should work within the SFN. So she put her efforts into the ad hoc committee, unlike Wynne, who was still holding out and really wanted to be independent of the SFN. But the ad hoc committee and Wynne collaborated on events and things too. And Mary would even attend some of the Wynne steering committee meetings. So how do I get this to go forward? Oops, sorry. Okay. She did two major things through the ad hoc committee. The first was there was this survey that the SFN was carrying out, and they had one that surveyed the demographics and the career paths of all the members of the society. But then there was this phase 2 survey that the ad hoc committee developed because they were concerned about questions that were raised, why fewer women were in tenure track positions, about 25%, compared the number of women getting PhDs in the biomedical sciences, in the particular the Society for Neuroscience. So they did a follow-up survey, and it went out to a smaller group of the society, but then the society cut them off. They said, we don't have enough money to keep carrying out these surveys. So then the survey went into limbo because there was no one to analyze the data. So Mary was leading this committee, still the ad hoc committee, and she was persistent about it. And she finally was connected with the Office of Science and Engineering personnel, and they did the analysis through the National Research Council and the National Academy of Sciences. And Mary wrote a newsletter article in the SFN about the results of that. So that survey would have just died, but she kept it going. The other really important thing is she was instrumental for establishment of a committee, standing committee on women in neuroscience within the SFN. So this is important. So this was interesting because in 1997, there's a letter in her file that says from Bruce McEwen, who was president of the SFN, asking Mary to become chair of the membership committee. And the ad hoc committee could become a subcommittee of the membership committee. And Mary she did not like this idea at all. And she was very strategic and stood by her principles, and she declined offer to be the chair of the membership committee. And her reasoning was this would just bury the ad hoc committee on women, and women's issues and professional development would not have a strong voice in the society anymore. And so she kept working through her committee to have the SFN approve a committee on women in neuroscience, and that happened in 1998. And it wasn't without some controversy. WIN still wanted to be separate, and they had the more vocal activists of the society. So there was maybe a little resentment of the ad hoc committee. And then many in the SFN membership, a number, didn't want a committee that focused just on women. They felt that was not inclusive. So anyway, the committee happened. Mary continued to be chair of the Committee on Women in Neuroscience for some time. And then later on in 2009 and continuing to now, that also, like what happened to Winter, there became a more global, inclusive professional development committee of the society, and CWIN, the Committee on Women in Neuroscience, and there was a CDIN, the Committee on Diversity in Neuroscience. Those were folded under this professional development committee. And it allowed the SFN to be more inclusive and develop new programs. So what about University of Miami? Because she was working on, that was at the national level. So there was a senior women faculty assembly that was meeting in the later half of the 1990s as well. These were discuss women faculty issues, and they were really pushing for a faculty development office, and were making recommendations to Dean Clarkson at the time. And so Mary kind of got the ear of Dean Clarkson, and they were looking for a new chair of the Department of Medicine, and so he put her on the committee so there would be someone who could help them identify strong women candidates for that position. Although that didn't happen, but at least there was a woman on the committee. There was also, later, Clarkson established a Women and Minority Leadership Development Committee. And this was really a medical school sort of mandated, not kind of like this ad hoc committee, the Senior Women's Faculty Assembly, to start to really work what should be in a faculty development office. And also they sort of did surveys and analysis of the what was the makeup of the faculty at UM. And So at that time, there were 67% were men and 33% were women. 83% of all tenured faculty were men, and only 17% of women were tenured. And of interest, when they looked at the data from 1994, remember this is 2002, they looked at the data from 1994, it was 24%. So there was actually a decrease in the number of women who were tenured. And then at that time, 73% of the tenure earning faculty were men, and there was about mid-20s for women, and of course very few minorities at that time. So we all know we do have a faculty development office, but all the things that they were recommending be part of this office, we're still working on establishing those things in our faculty development office today. So it really takes a long time to make change and implement these things. But Mary was really a big part of that. So Dalton already went through her noteworthy awards and lectures and honors, so I'm not going to go through this in any detail again, but I did want to point out she was considered one of the most influential women in Florida, and I think it's up here. She was a member of the NIH Search Committee to recommend a new director of NINDS, and that is the committee that appointed Story Landis, who was a fantastic director of NINDS. So she was really part of helping there become a woman who was promoted into that position. Okay, so Mary had a lifetime of interest in women scientists, and she really was connected to women of her generation. And so these are 4 people that I just want to note briefly, and all of them share the challenge of being a woman in science. And initially they came from a time where they just wanted to do their science and be respected for their work. And they didn't start thinking about these issues of equity, et cetera, until the 70s. I mentioned Florence Moog already. She was chair of botany, and she had an active research program. There was correspondence from a lifelong friend, Gabrielle Zurine, who was, I guess, someone she knew from University of Wisconsin. Years and years of letters saved in her files. She was a well-known neuropathologist, so they shared their love of electron microscopy. And then Mildred Trotter, I'll talk about in a minute. She was actually a faculty of anatomy at WashU and a beloved teacher. And then later on in life, when we had the Mary Bartlett Bunge lecture, one of our speakers was Marilyn Farquhar, who was a well-known cell biologist. She was the speaker in 2010, and she was the spouse of George Pilati, who was famous Rockefeller and then Yale, and then they moved to San Diego. They were a team, and they just really bonded because they were from the exact same generation, and they would take vacations together. So it was very nice to see that happen. So the other thing about Mary is she collected many, many articles about women scientists. The one on the left is actually not just scientists, but it was a Time Women of the Year article in her files. And then here's one about Rita Levi-Montalcini when she turned 100. She was also a WashU faculty member. Multiple articles about Rita in her files. And then here are some other just examples. Rosalind Yallow, Barbara McClintock, et cetera. And but they weren't just biomedical oriented scientists or biologists. She had physicists, someone who worked on the A-bomb, someone who worked on the Hubble telescope. So she had a broad interest about women and their careers. The other thing is she collected many articles about women's career advancement. These show ones like about the leaky pipeline, why women are lost in their ranks, the pace of progress in academia is slow, sex discrimination, and then things about leadership, do women get the fair share of prizes and awards, etc. And then she also had a lot of articles about career and family. And in particular, she saved a lot about dual career families. So couples in cell biology, dualing academic careers, opportunities to expand to career couples, best practices for recruitment and retention of dual career couples, and things about work-life balance for women that women usually or often faced. And then there were a lot of articles about mentoring as well. So all of this is in her collection, and I think she wanted to write a book about famous women scientists, and she never got that opportunity, but she had all the material there that she wanted. And I'll say most of those articles were on women scientists were obituaries in the New York Times, so she was an avid reader of the Times. So the last thing, and I'm almost done, is just to talk about her legacy here at UM. So Mary established the Mary Bartlett Bunge Distinguished Women in Cell Biology lecture series here, and that was in 2006. So it's really, I think, Mildred Trotter who was the inspiration for this, because when Mildred Trotter came to WashU in like 1920 and got her degrees there, and she became a renowned physical anthropologist and was an amazing teacher of anatomy there. And in 1975, the WashU Medical Alumni Association established a fund to endow a lectureship in Mildred Trotter's name, to bring distinguished women scientists to WashU. And Mary was on the nomination committee for 5 years there, and then later on actually was the Mildred Trotter lecturer for that lecture series. So when Mary won the Lois Pope Life Research Foundation Award, as Dalton already mentioned, there's Lois Pope on the left and Donna Shalala on the right, she'd endowed a lecture in her name, and it was to bring in leaders in their research field, but to also focus on mentoring and career development. So in this series, we've had 19 lectures so far. Next year will be our 20th anniversary. 17 were in the National Academy of Science. There were 14 Howard Hughes Institute investigators, a number of past presidents of the ASCD, one from the Genetic Society, and many other awards that this distinguished group of women received. And I just want to thank people who were part of this. We have a lot of past members. A special call out, I think, to Mary Lou King, who was a long-term member, and Kathleen Tosney, who had a NSF award, advance award, we called it Seeds here, and they also supported this lectureship for a period of time. And then our current members are myself, long-term member Julia Verity, Arietta and Louisa, who are two junior faculty, and now we have a postdoc and student on the committee, which has really enlivened our group for sure. And we had great administrative support, particularly Maria Penton and Maria Shagoyan here at the Miami Project, who helps us with the lecture series. And then all the other groups that have supported this lecture, the Cell Biology Department, the Miami Project, the Center for Neuroscience, the Seeds Award I mentioned, and also the Dean of the School of Medicine has been supporting this lectureship. So these are just some examples of the committee with the lecturer after the event. This was Cynthia Kenyon, who works on aging, Elaine Fuchs, who works on stem cell biology, and Huda Zogby, who's a developmental neurobiologist. And then just to remind you about the mentorship part, of this lecture series. There's always a lunch with student and postdocs after the lecture, and then a mentoring session for the whole community. And then in the evening, a mentoring and networking dinner for young faculty and senior postdocs. So this is an example of Christy Anseth giving her mentoring session talk, and she had interesting words of wisdom to present in her talk, and then everybody in the audience could ask her questions. Here at the top, she's saying, you can get knowledge anywhere today. It's really how you use it that matters now. And then she gave some key take-home messages. And then this would be the audience at the mentoring session. And then at the networking dinner, it was great. It was not just women. It included male and female faculty. In the middle is Joan Stites, and then Huda Zogby. And then in the right-hand corner is, afterwards, we all gather around in a circle, and everybody can ask questions of the invited speaker. So those are very memorable events. And so I asked the past lecturers to send some comments about their experience. And so the first is, it's an honor for me to be selected as the 2012 Mary Bartlett Bunge Distinguished Women in Cell Biology Lecture, and to meet Mary, a truly inspiring woman. I love that she specifically chose to recognize women in cell biology. That was Joan Brugge. And Huda Zogby wrote, I was thrilled to visit and meet with scientists across campus. Mary's influence and reach was palatable and inspiring. I had a great time and thoroughly enjoyed the evening with women faculty and young faculty gathering around and asking me questions about navigating a career in science. It was a most pleasant and moving, meaningful experience. And finally, from Huda Zogby, what I enjoyed most about Mary is, Elaine Fuchs, I apologize. What I most enjoyed about Mary is that she was not only a terrific scientist, but also down to earth. Like my mother, she sewed her own clothes. Like my own childhood, she was fascinated by tadpole metamorphosis. And while Mary's father felt women didn't need a college education, mine felt that women should go to college but learn to be good secretaries or elementary school teachers. Fortunately, women like Mary inspired women like me to pursue their passion, no matter what the odds. So I think we can all thank Mary for all she's done for women in neuroscience and the legacy she's left here at the University of Miami. So I just want to say one other thing. My husband said I should have some take-home messages from our whole event today. So the first is that others have talked about Mary as a scientist. She was a groundbreaking and amazing scientist in her own right. She published single-author papers on fundamental aspects of neural development that has appeared in textbook for ages. She had an amazingly strong and productive and exciting research program, well into her 80s. She was a warrior, too. She was a warrior for women in science. She fought behind the scenes, and she fought out in front of it for equality for women in science. And she was a mentor. She created opportunities for young scientists, especially women, to learn from successful women scientists, including herself. So I'll end there, and that's it.
Thank you very much.